You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And it is time now for our bi-weekly Women's Hockey Spotlight, and it's my pleasure to welcome back Erica L. Ayala of Locked On Kraken and, of course, of Locked On NHL. Erica, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Gil. It's great to be back. The gang's all here.
It's nice to have you here in person. It's great.
Indeed, indeed. Well, we have plenty to talk about when it comes to women's hockey from the last Women's Hockey Spotlight I did. So I believe the last update would have been on, just some of the locations for the teams. Just as a recap, there are 6 PWHL teams, and we talked a little bit about locations. We also, via some sleuthing and trademark applications, perhaps have some names that are being tossed around: the Toronto Torch, the Montreal Echo, the Ottawa Alert, the Minnesota Superior, the Boston Wicked, and the New York Sound. The Boston Wicked, I think my main comment there is just that, there's a special anniversary for the musical Wicked. So that's that's immediately where my mind went. But also,
we just had that this past weekend.
We'll see if these turn out to be the names. But what else has been interesting is that we've seen the PWHL use social media and its new website to announce some of its signings. And so some of the language is a little bit confusing. So I'm just going to go over what we know. As I've talked about before on the Women's Hockey Spotlight, each team had the opportunity to sign 3 players outright, effectively kind of their marquee players in the WNBA. You might say these are like their cord players. And those players for all 6 teams have been officially signed on their tracker. And then there have been additional signings, those coming from the draft in particular. So most of the teams, all of the teams have at least 4 players signed. So Montreal bringing up the rear. They only have 1 additional signing, Kristen O'Neill, outside of their main 3 cord players. But then Ottawa, on the other hand, has 11 signings, including Daryl Watts. You might have heard me talk about her before because she was set to be the highest paid player in women's professional hockey when she signed, I guess it was $200K Canadian with at the time, Toronto 6 from the defunct Premier Hockey Federation. She signed a 1-year contract. Also, Haley Skamura signed with Ottawa as well. Other players, Jamie Lee Rattray and Teresa Schwarzwald, signing in Boston. And you have Jade Downey-Landry, who played in the PHF, and Ella Shelton signing in New York. I mentioned O'Neill signing in Montreal. You have also Rebecca Leslie, I believe, is the highest signed draft pick for Toronto. And for Minnesota, no surprise, Taylor Heisey has been signed. Their 3 cord players, effectively. I'm just going to use the term cord. It's not something the league is using, but it just helps me. Kendall Coyne-Schofield, Kelly Panic, Lee Steckline. They definitely are going for that local, feel. Nicole Hensley is also signed, was one of their draft picks, and Grace Zumwinkle. So also a lot of national team flair there.
Yeah, it's really interesting with the team signings where you look at a team like Minnesota, they've signed their top 3 draft picks. And some of the teams, it's more spread out. So there's some top draft picks, there's some lower round draft picks. Is this just a timing and negotiation thing, or is there some rhyme or reason to this?
Yeah, and that's where we just don't know enough, to be quite honest, with this kind of first round of signings. Are they draft pick signings? Are they free agent signings? We've had that in women's hockey before, where there were draft picks but they were effectively free agents. So I think some of the language itself is confusing. Also, right after the draft, I was able to go to the draft in Toronto. Some of what you were hearing is that European players, and when we interviewed them, they were saying that they committed to some of the Euro leagues up to a point, and that they then had to either negotiate with that club to be released from that contract. Some had signed European contracts with the expectation that they would be leaving for the new league. And then what we've heard since, Rachel, is that there is question whether some of those players that have signed contracts in Europe are going to come over to the PWHL and I've effectively exercised their draft rights. I don't know how much autonomy the players have versus the clubs, but some of those players might not come over and play in the inaugural season of the PWHL that is set to drop the puck in January. It's already November, so we're ticking down the clock here. Not to mention that there are draft picks who are going to have to wait to know their fate, because we're going to have training camps that are set to start this month that will likely happen after the Rivalry Series. So some of those national team players can be back with their local PWHL teams.
I know that rosters are not set yet, and it's still a work in progress. But is there one team right now whose signings have impressed you the most?
Well, I mean, just by the sheer amount, I'm definitely looking at Ottawa. And Ottawa has been a team that has impressed me in how they even approached the draft. So I think that's really interesting. You definitely want to take a look also at what Minnesota has been able to do in locking in a goaltender like Nicole Hensley. We know some other teams, maybe some interesting picks when it comes to goalies, and still trying to figure out who their marquee goaltenders are going to be. But we know how important goaltending is. And so I think Minnesota maybe caught up in some areas that I thought were a little bit questionable, for them immediately following the draft.
Talk to us about the Rivalry Series. What do we know about that?
So we're getting started. The Rivalry Series is going to the Mullet, Tempe, Arizona. That's the last time I was there was for the PHF, what turned out to be the last Isabel Cup championship, where the Toronto Six won. But that's going to happen November 8th. So coming up November 8th and again, November 11th, they're going to be at crypto.com. So first going to Mullet Arena in Tempe, and then to LA. So right off the hop, you see that the United States, USA Hockey, and Hockey Canada are really taking advantage, I should say, of their NHL partnerships. I would love to see if any of the NHL arenas do what the Seattle Kraken did and what Climate Pledge Arena did, and actually offer their NHL broadcast team to call these games. We see that all of them are going to be on the NHL network, but we got spoiled to hear John Forsland and Allison Lucan call the Rivalry Series game when it was at Climate Pledge Arena at CPA. So I'm hoping that we see some of that. And we do have a few other opportunities. I mentioned Mullet, Crypto.com, also the Excel Center. Those are the locations in the US. And then there's 4 more between December 14th and February 9th that will be in Canada.
I'm really curious because the Rivalry Series locations in the US are all at NHL arenas. The ones in Canada are all at non-NHL arenas in other locations, Kitchener, Ontario, Sarnia, Saskatoon. And I think that it's just a really interesting difference in strategy there, and that, bringing the Rivalry Series to maybe some non-NHL markets in the US might be a good thing.
I think you can think of it both ways. Yes, it would be great to have more access in the United States to, quote unquote, non-NHL markets. But on the other side of things, hockey fans in those areas are likely familiar with the NHL arenas, and you can get more people there. And what we've seen from the Rivalry Series, whether it was, I believe it was Montreal that hosted, that's Bell Center, right?
Yeah.
And then again at Climate Pledge Arena, those Rivalry Series games last year were the highest grossing in attendance for the Rivalry Series ever, and for women's hockey ever. So on the one hand, if you're looking at maybe wanting to get local markets involved, I can see where you're coming from, Rachel. On the other hand, I feel like maybe you're arbitrarily capping the attendance and therefore, what you make at the gate by perhaps not engaging NHL markets in Canada.
Got some news about Harvard, VenLoi joining Harvard. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, first of all, if you are chomping at the bit like I am for women's hockey to hit the ice again, and just watching NHL games until we get some more of that. The good news is that we have the NCAA, and as I mentioned, the Rivalry Series coming. But I really wanted to spend some time talking about VenLoi because she is a hockey mind, particularly on the women's side and the international level, that understands how hockey is evolving. And I was so excited. We actually had a women's hockey spotlight episode featuring her and her plans for the Riveters, and then everything changed. So we weren't able to push that through. But VenLoi is going to be an assistant coach for the Harvard team. Harvard is a storied program. So many Olympians have come out of that program. It's also worth noting that Harvard has gone through a change and really hasn't been forthcoming with a quote unquote reckoning after some very odd traditions, including a naked Superman skate. I mean, I don't know. Hopefully I don't have to explain that anymore. Just bare flesh on ice and in a Superman pose. So that would be, chest down. So on the one hand, this is great for VenLoi. This is great for hockey. On the other hand, I personally am going to keep a keen eye on how the Harvard program is not just moving on, but also how they're addressing some things culturally that have been longstanding for the last 30 plus years under their former head coach.
Well, we'll definitely keep an eye on that. Erica, thank you so much. Great to have you here, and looking forward to having you back in 2 weeks.
Always a pleasure. And so don't forget, you can find the Rivalry Series. That's going to be on NHL Network. Don't know who the broadcast teams are yet, but I will be back in another 2 weeks, as you mentioned, Gil, to recap that and get you ready for what we know coming up for the PWHL season.